And good morning, church. Good to see you here today. Glad that you are able to visit. And speaking of which, I know that we do have some visitors that are passing through town, some that are here for the very first time. We want you to know we are thrilled that you could be here with us. Very grateful for your presence, and it's just a joy to be able to worship with people and put our focus where it needs to be on the Lord's Day. So we're thankful that you could join us in that. We've had a lot of great things happening in this past week. Certainly reasons to celebrate. Prayers have been answered, and certain health concerns seem like they're on the mend and moving forward. Very grateful for those things. Vacation Bible School was fantastic. I believe Alan said this is the best numbers we've had since 2015. 2015, that's so fantastic to hear. Really want to thank Stephanie Miller and the team that she put together for that. Jonathan Host for the visuals and everything he did in constructing all that. We really want to thank the teachers and all the people that really participated. I mean, there was a lot of people that made this happen. I know I'd spoken to Sheila and Lisa and the others that had done the games in the activity centers, and certainly everyone that invited people and made it such a good VBS. Really grateful for that. What a special time. Second of all, it's Father's Day, and we want to say Happy Father's Day and let you know how much we do appreciate fathers. Culturally, sometimes it doesn't get said enough. In the TV shows, it used to be the tradition that the fathers were sort of the goofy person that, the butt of everyone's jokes. Underappreciated. Fathers are very necessary parts of the family, and so those of you that uphold the family, lead spiritually, we're thankful for what you do, and certainly in the kingdom. And those that that are single fathers, that keep it up, very much appreciate you, and we need to herald that quite a bit more. Other good news that we kind of want to end on before we jump into the sermon is baptisms. I had two baptisms last Sunday, I believe, and so Zach Coplea and Courtney Coplea, want to ask you all if you'll stand up, please. They were baptized last Sunday, and we're very grateful for the study that you've been doing with Alan. And if you have not yet had a chance to meet them and speak to them, welcome my brother and sister into our church family. Thank you all so much. Thank you so much. Appreciate your hearts tremendously. So we're going to jump into it. How much more? How much more? At this point, you've probably noticed we've been hitting some of the parables that are throughout the Gospels, focusing pretty heavy in Luke. Not surprising. We spent a lot of time in John in the last few months. We've moved over to Luke a little bit. And our theme for the year is Jesus first. If you're just visiting, we really want you to know that that's the thing that we're trying to put our focus on this year. What does life look like if Jesus is first in your life? What decisions must you make if Jesus is first? What blessings do you receive if Jesus is first? How does he direct your life? Through his nature, his will, his purpose, through the wisdom that comes through Christ, through the example of Christ. Who can you become because of the sacrifice of Christ? And what opportunities open up for you because of Jesus Christ? Christianity isn't just a pleasant lifestyle that you exist in. Christianity was never meant to be a thing where you simply come once a week and sit in a pew. Christianity is the fullness of life. The fullness of life. The way that we think, the way that we feel, the way that we treat one another, the way that we look forward to tomorrow, the way that we sit in today with great hope, the way that we exist every single moment. That is Christianity. And what does that look like? What must it look like if Jesus is first? We spent a lot of time talking about what that would look like, affecting our identity, our sense of belonging, and our purpose. Now we're moving into a section where we're looking at specific teachings of Jesus. His parables. We've done two, and there were parables that were not as difficult to unfold, but if you only look at the surface, we miss out on a lot of the depth. So we've been also exploring ways that you would go in and try to understand most fully, most completely, what Jesus is communicating. Jesus came to the earth to communicate the will of God. And we will be blessed, and our faith will grow when we spend time searching through that. Perspective is a big factor of that, especially as you dive into certain parables. What perspective do I take into it? This image is one that I chose, obviously. We subscribe to Adobe stock photos, and so a lot of times I'll go through and I'll look for an image like, okay, that kind of fits. Last week I used one of a man praying, and that seemed to be pretty clear. and I felt like totally it fit and everything worked. I really liked this image because I was like, yeah, there's a fella praying. I even like the little details in it, the way his hands are not so formally structured. It felt like a natural prayer, even just his pinkies, the way they were put together. I know, you're like, that detail, does that matter? Yeah, it kind of matters. Stock photos sometimes look so unnatural, and so I want something that looks a little more natural at least. I thought, that guy's doing something pretty intense. I kind of like it. And so I got to download it and get ready to get the image and was going to reframe it, reshape it, color, all the things that you normally do. But then as I was doing so, I looked at the title of it. And it said, Man with Hands Covering Face, Feeling Worried. Feeling worried? That's a dude praying, right? And then I thought, that's what I brought to the table when looking at the image. I'm getting it for a sermon, churchy. I'm looking at it based on last week's sermon, churchy. And going into it with the whole thing about Jesus first, churchy. Of course, I'm looking at it with the perspective of this is a churchy situation. Great, that makes sense. But the person who took the photo totally didn't have that in place. Man with hands covering face, feeling worried. I get it. I get that. Because when I thought about it, I was like, oh yeah, because sometimes you do this when you're worried, you're concerned. Their intent was to have nothing to do with prayer, perhaps. But I'm going back and it's like, maybe he's doing both. Maybe. But it's the way that you come at it. If I had started with an image like this, where someone looks like they are in the depths of misery, maybe I would have gone that way with feeling worried. Even if I'd gone this, where someone was looking very, very frustrated, maybe I would have gone into it. Or even this, where someone is on the verge of tears and just breaking apart. If I'd gone into that, sure. But I started here. A man praying. There's a Bible in front of him. The perspective you take to it can affect the way that you understand it. That can be helpful. That can be helpful. It'll play out in our parable today. Go to Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. Luke 16, 1 through 8. We're going to read verses 1 through 7 first, and then we're going to break some things down. Jesus first. Jesus first. That's what we're going through in this parable. We've talked about the parable of the lost sheep. Talked about the parable of the neighbor asking for 3 loaves. This is called sometimes the parable of the unjust steward. Unjust steward. Let's read. He also said to his disciples, critical point. In the last week's parable, you know that he was addressing issues with the scribes and the Pharisees because they were condemning the time he was given to tax collectors and sinners. And so he addressed something to them, and they had to unpack it. Well, that was a couple weeks ago. And then last week was really there was a request about prayer. And so he was explaining about prayer. Now he's talking to his disciples a very specific thing. There was a certain rich man who had a steward, and an accusation was brought to him that this man was wasting his goods. So he called him, and he said to him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your stewardship, for you can no longer be steward." And then shifts to the steward. The steward said within himself, "What shall I do? For my master has taken the stewardship away from me. I cannot dig. I'm too ashamed to beg. I have resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses." So he called every one of his master's debtors to him, and he said to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" And he said, 100 measures of oil. So he said to him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, write 50. Then he said to another, "How much do you owe?" And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, "Take your bill and write 80. Verse 7. When we come to that, we see some unusual things in this parable. I mean, comparatively speaking. Parable of the lost sheep, you got a shepherd, 100 sheep, one's missing, he goes out. There's a sense of that. You're like, okay, I can kind of get where that's going in a general sense. Request for 3 loaves, neighbors in need, visitors coming. At midnight goes to his neighbor and says, "Hey, can you give me 3 loaves of bread?" And he gives excuses not to, but eventually he relents. And that was all about, understanding God and being able to know God and go through prayer. This is unusual, isn't it? These are not good guys, are they? I mean, the unjust steward, not really a good person. And typically when we go into parables, what makes this one difficult is the people in the parable, usually there's an example there that we are supposed to emulate, right? We're supposed to emulate something in the parable. There's something instructive in it. And yet, in this one, there does not seem to be good people. The steward himself lives for himself. He's very driven by self-interest. He was given a task to be a steward of a wealthy man's business affairs. It seems the man was incredibly wealthy because he had debtors to him that had mass bits of land. These weren't peasant people, the debtors that he went to. The measures that they are dealing with in their debts are pretty big. You can go back and you can study those and you can do some comparisons. And what we find is that oil, when he asked for the oil, that's over 600 gallons of oil that he's in debt to over this. 600 gallons. That is a massive crop of oil. The one with the wheat, it is, they estimate, over 200 acres worth of crops that have been given there. So these are not just kind of getting by subsistence farmers. The people that are in debt to him, massive bits of land, and it seems that there's many of them. So this is someone with incredible wealth. The guy's a steward over it. He squandered his master's money for self-interest, and he's being cast aside. And he says, I got to do something. I got to do something. I'm not physically capable of digging, so he couldn't do manual labor. And if he's cast out, he's probably not going to be hired by anybody else. Word will get around. So he's not capable of digging. He's also too ashamed to beg, so pride is sitting in him, and he can't bring himself to even be a beggar. So he starts thinking, I know what I'll do. I know what I'll do. I'll go to the people who are debtors, and I'm going to plead with them, and I'm going to reduce their debts. Why is he doing this? So his hope is that they will be bound by honor. Since he did them a favor, they'll do him a favor. He will not be out on his street. His ambition is to provide for himself. And you say to yourself as you hear this, okay, I hear a story. Where's the Christian element in this? I find this a tough one to wrestle with. Have for a long time. You're going back and forth on it. What's the Christian element in this? Could it be the rich man at the beginning? Tricky. If that's the case, it's very unlike the way that Jesus has been dealing with the rich people throughout the book of Luke in general. And it's not that Jesus is opposed to people being rich. It's that they're lovers of money and they've allowed the wealth to lead them astray. There's a whole series of passages where he's been dealing with that throughout the entire gospel. In chapter 6, there's woes that he's given to the people that fare sumptuously and they give no regard to the other people, and their only emphasis is on this life and the blessings of this life. He says, whoa, be cautious in that situation. You remember, there's also the parable of the rich fool who was so caught up in the pleasures of his wealth that he thought he would sit back and do nothing, and yet it cost him his life. It was taken that night, and his wealth meant nothing. It amounted to nothing in that regard. And certainly there was the issues with the Pharisees, which would be known as people who did love money. We'll get to that shortly. But they would use it to elevate themselves into position so they would have this outward appearance of being quite grand and present themselves as very religious to people and men of status. And Jesus would condemn them around Luke chapter 14. Outward appearances, but inwardly they were not what they should have been. Yeah, typically through Luke, there's this wrestling with wealth and the right way to use wealth. And thematically, that's going to come even in later chapters as we think of the rich young ruler and what he needed to confront. Jesus didn't confront him because he was wealthy. It was because it led him in a way away from God. And so he's teaching these lessons on the way to maintain that and keep your focus and be driven. Even Zacchaeus would be here in just 3 more chapters. Zacchaeus was a very wealthy tax collector, but is in the management of that, taking it from people. But in his repentance, he gave excessively, 4 times what he took, gave half his wealth to the poor, and that was heralded as a great thing. We can get that, we can see that. But in this story, who's the good guys? Who's the good guys? What are we supposed to emulate? And that gets a little bit more confusing when we read verse 8. Because in this story, we can see that the rich man has been done poorly. The steward's taken his money for self-interest. That's not good. And then before people realize that he's fired, he went out to the other debtors, and it wasn't his own money he was forgiven. It was the wealthy man's money that he was forgiven. You owe him 100, mark it 50. It's not costing the steward money, it's costing the rich man money. You owe him 100 on the week, you owe him, mark it 80. 50%, 20%, cutting his money. You would expect at this point what's going to happen next in the story. You would expect, well, surely given the other stories, if this is the weeping and gnashing of teeth kind of parable here, that guy's going to jail at best. He's going to be killed at the worst. This is going nowhere good, right? But then verse 8 takes an interesting turn, so much like a parable. Parables really challenge the way that we think. Jesus is really challenging our thinking on this. So the master, verse 8, commended the unjust steward. What? The master commended the man who had just taken his wealth and then took more of his wealth without his permission. He did it after he was fired. The master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. What is unfolding here? Is Jesus telling us to have worldly wisdom that will be recognized for that? No. Even in the next verse, when he's talking about what to do with unrighteous mammon, money, it seems confusing what's unfolding. This is a part where our challenge is to look at a parable. Don't go on the surface. We've got to look at a bigger picture. Our focus is on what Jesus wants us to do. So, when we look at this, wealthy man, steward, all right, there's a point to this. What can we know? What can we know for certain? This is what's instructive in this. The expectation of a parable is to clarify and prompt a response based on the words of Jesus. That's the purpose of a parable. We've seen that in every single other parable. And they're very, very common in the teaching style of Jesus. Now, they weren't always easy. If you remember in the parable of the sower, the man who was sowing seeds, even his disciples said, Lord, can you explain to us what this means? And then Jesus would explain it. So there is an explanation, there's a sense of clarity, but when it's given, there's an expectation that you would respond in a way. This is no different. There's a point of clarity about a teaching of Jesus and expectation that they would respond. The disciples and all who heard, even us today. And it wasn't just the disciples who would hear this. You can tell down by verse 14 that the Pharisees were present as well, and it was for them just as much. But number two, Jesus teaches what will bring us closer to God. Jesus' teaching and his parables has to do with what will bring us closer to God. Perhaps that's an understanding of the nature of God, and that will compel us to move towards it. Perhaps it'll be something that will contrast with the ways of the world, and we will choose to go with what's righteous rather than what's unrighteous. But the nature of a parable is to compel us, to bring us closer in a relationship with God. They are not just intellectual exercises, but they are things that are given to move you in a direction that is closer to God. And most importantly, Jesus is the one teaching. We can't let go of that. Jesus will be Jesus and only Jesus. That's really, really important to understand. Meaning, if Jesus is trying to bring us closer to God, well, that's a God thing to do. If Jesus is trying to clarify a truth essential in our faith, that's a Jesus thing to do. If Jesus' intent is to move us and allow us to choose to respond faithfully, that's a God thing to do. But it's most important in the perspective we take into the parable. Most important. Because if we know we're starting from the perspective of Jesus, who is right, who is true, who is the Word, who is faithful, who cannot lie, who loves us, who is just, who does not sin, has never sinned, there's no guile found in his mouth. If we know that's the person bringing that, with the fullness of his being in the teaching, it certainly shapes our understanding of the parable. It allows us to discern what it can't be. Well, if that's Jesus teaching it, and he's trying to draw us closer to God, and we're expected to respond in a way that will do that, we know what it can't be. And I got to tell you, this parable has confused some people. This parable is used sometimes as an excuse for people to behave in like maybe times. It's not the only passage in the Bible that does that. We all know that Rahab, she told a lie at a particular point to protect some Israelites. Because of that, some people say, I guess sometimes it's okay to tell lies. Well, no, it's not. It's not like the lie was the only option, but it is what she did. There's never a time in which God encouraged us to move towards sinfulness and to use that as an excuse. You can never try, even if you think it's going to have a good outcome, you can't use sin to get there. Jesus wouldn't teach that. Jesus will be Jesus. He expresses the very nature, the will, and the purpose of God purely. Purely. And so if that's the case, we're not being told to do anything that's sinful, immoral, or worldly. So in no way do we emulate the rich man in this case or the steward. The rich man is commending him for his wisdom in worldly ways. We are not to be people who commend people in their worldly ways, to uphold that as a high value. Not what we're doing. We're also not being encouraged in any way to pursue self-interests, even if it looks like we might appear to be merciful in some regard, even though it may look like we're making the master, and this is what some people have done, well, you're making the master look better. That's a win, right? Not the point at all. And we know that from that last verse, that last half of verse 8, when he says again, the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. That's not saying be a son of this world, sinfulness. They are more shrewd. There is worldly wisdom. And we see that all the time in a multitude of things. You ever see Ocean's 11? At least maybe you're aware of it. You ever see The Godfather? Part 1, Part 2, 3? Your choice. You ever see this movie, Usual Suspects? You know what's interesting about these movies? They're all bad guys. They're all bad guys. None of these people are good guys in the movie. They're criminals. They're all criminals. You don't watch the movie going like, man, I can't wait to be a criminal. But these are insanely popular movies. If you do think that, repent now. That's not the point. It's not the point. But there are fascinating things about these characters. Maybe they're very charismatic. They're very stylish. It's very cool the way that they make something unfold. There is a shrewdness and there's a wisdom in the way that they navigate through the world that they're in. Ocean's 11 is about a great criminal heist to steal over $160 million in Las Vegas. Well, that's fascinating. And it's this incredibly clever, complicated plan in which groups of guys come together and there's amidst loyalty, trust, and secret handshakes of sorts and whatnot. It's fun. But it doesn't mean go be a criminal. Godfather, that's about family. That's good, right? No, Fredo, no. But it's awesome. And it is about loyalty and stuff, but it doesn't mean go be a criminal. In fact, don't, especially this way. It's hyper-violent. This one of the great shocking twists, and I won't reveal it in many movies whatsoever, but you're not going to go away from it. It's like, man, I wish I could be Kaiser Soze. These aren't just explanations of how to be sinful or to chase it, just like in this parable. But there are things to pay attention to, like in the parable. If people are that wise worldly, and they are commending each other for their wisdom in a worldly circumstance, and that's a world we don't participate in because it's so contrary to Jesus, it's so contrary to God, maybe there's something more out of that, and they got wisdom, sure, but it's not the right kind of wisdom, is it? There's a vast difference between worldly wisdom and godly wisdom. They do have some self-recognition, and we say self-recognition is fantastic. He knew he couldn't dig. He knew he was too prideful to go out and work, and he used that as an opportunity, not for good, but to go take advantage of a situation for his own self-interest, not a Christian belief. He did it with urgency. There's a value in that from a Christian sense. And he took action. There's a value in that from a Christian sense. But it was all in the wrong direction. And Jesus closes out and says, look, of course the rich man's going to commend him. They're celebrating their own world, but guess what? That's not your world. If people are that wise in worldly ways, the big question is, how much more should you be as the Son of the Most High in the ways of the kingdom of God, which is greater than this world, which stands eternal? We cannot be impressed with the ways of the world. We shouldn't even be wise in them our own selves. We should be simple in the ways of the world, in the ways of evil. But if the evil people are that great and that skillful and that shrewd to the point that they complement each other in it, even where they take a loss, how much more should the sons of the Most High, that's you and me, be in the ways of the kingdom of God? I know, it doesn't make a good movie, does it? How many movies exist where you see someone be the most exceptional Christian possible and you're like, wow, that's the best movie possible? Not many. I know it doesn't translate well on the internet where we see a lot of train wrecks, destruction, arguments, fights, things of the world. Relationships fall apart, and man, the views, they just skyrocket. The clicks skyrocket because of it. The number of clicks, the ratio between those versus the ones where something exceptionally good happens, it's not very high. It's not good. But that doesn't mean we don't do what's good. At no point were the actions of Christianity ever going to be the most popular. That gets told over and over and over again to the disciples. Jesus told them, they hate me. They're going to hate you. There'll even be a time in which people will call good things evil and evil things good. We're familiar with that. But nonetheless, if that's how devoted that world is, and the people of the world, if they're that devoted to what's evil and wrong and sinful and good, how much more should you be to the things that are good, the things that are merciful, the things that are kind, the things that are love, the things that have to do with benefiting other people? Let's break this down more specifically. That guy was taking money for his own self-interests, so that he would not become a beggar. Contrast that with the idea of what comes earlier in the scriptures, the before part in Jesus' teacher and the after. What comes before? Luke chapter 6. Go with me there real quick. We'll sit in this one for just a second, and this will really kind of hone it in a little bit more. The difference between the ways of the world versus the way of God, and how much more we should be dedicated to it. Jesus says to them in this passage in Luke 6, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do the same. Expectation from the parable. That resonates with the parable we just read so much. That steward was only doing a favor to those people so they would do something back for him. Only reason, selfish. And if you lend to those for whom you hope to receive back, what credit is that to you? For even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much back. But love your enemies. Do good. And lend, hoping for nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the unthankful and evil. Therefore, be merciful, just as your Father also is merciful. If the world wants to operate in a sinful and evil way, you have no part of it whatsoever. But in a greater contrast than that, because you are living a greater life, pursuing a greater God, going to a greater purpose, going to a greater home, that is eternal, you, even more, how much more should you be in the skills, the wisdom, the recognition, the opportunity, the urgency, and the actions for that which is good, or exemplifies the Most High? How much more should we be in mercy and in love? Consider almsgiving. That's a thing that was normal for the poor. Can you imagine a person that would walk up and they would give money to a poor person and expect it back with interest, or at least some sort of favor back? That's not very Christian at all. He's challenging social norms here. Even in relationships, friendships like the steward had with those debtors, he's doing a thing expecting something back. There would be an obligation forced to it, and he's saying you rise above that. You do and expect nothing back. Nothing back. What if you tear down those expectations that if I do for you, you do for me? What if you just do it because it's right and it's good and it's love and it's to be a blessing? You know who does that? Jesus. You know who does that? God. So, how much more should the sons of the Most High do the same? And if we do that, we eliminate so much separation in the world that occurs between the people that have and the people that don't have. and the people that feel like they're under obligation to reciprocate some sort of behavior. What if we tore all that apart? And what if you could sit next to each other and say, we're Christians, and that's what matters. Our faith is what matters. Our actions in Christ are what matters. Our thoughts in Christ are what matters. And our wisdom in God is what matters. What if those are the things that dominate? He illustrates it even further in Luke chapter 16, doesn't he? You will remember this. We don't have time to read the parable in its entirety, but it's the rich man and Lazarus. And again, it's dealing with wealth that had led a man astray. He didn't handle it in a godly way. And there was a poor man outside his gates who had nothing. The dogs would even lick his wound. He hoped for the crumbs, while the rich man fared sumptuously in his fine clothes and his fine feast and all that kind of stuff. And the point was, he gave no consideration. In the wisdom and the ways of the world, he excelled and would be commended in the ways of the world for what he had done. But it's not godly ways at all, because he gave no regard for the man who went without. You had a more than enough, and you couldn't provide even a bit of love, sympathy, care, concern for those who have nothing. How much more should we be concerned with the people around us? How much more should we be dedicated to the purposes, the will, and nature of God than the sinful people are to the ways of the world? It is reshaping the way that we approach life with Jesus first. It is challenging. It is challenging because sometimes when we go into a situation and we look at it and we say, okay, I know the way the world would want me to handle the situation. And maybe I even know the way that my tendencies that I'm working on developing spiritually would lend me to think about a person in need. Or maybe I'm trying to find a way to socially manipulate a situation to get better from me. I know those things exist. I mean, they make very popular movies about those. It's normal. But what if I didn't approach it that way? And what if I started thinking in a God way? How is God exemplified in this situation? And what about if I stopped thinking about what would lift me up, what would lift that other person up? That's a Jesus way of thinking, to be certain. That's challenging at times, because it means that we also have to have that recognition as well. What are our physical limitations, but what are our spiritual limitations? The steward dove into his spiritual limitations. I'm too prideful to do. He gave no regard to changing whatsoever. What about if we recognize ours and say, okay, I recognize those, and I'm going to navigate closer to God. I'm not going to ignore it. I'm going to navigate closer to God. And that may be really, really hard, but God's going to be there with me in it. And I may not have a clear path on how to do that, but God did give me His Word, and it is full of passages. If anything, I hope you've seen how Luke has kind of tied this whole theme together throughout his whole book about not allowing those things to lead you off track. There's more. There's amazing things. In fact, fun fact for those of you Bibles want to read things, maybe connected, maybe not, but if you look back to Ezra chapter 7, the amount of goods that Artaxerxes gave to Ezra is the exact same amount of oil and wheat that you find in this parable. Could be a weird coincidence, maybe. I don't know. I'm going to read about it later. But it's interesting how it all connects in some way. God also gave you not just His Word, but He gave you His people. And whatever you struggle with, the odds are someone else in this room has struggled in that regard. Hopefully, we are such a degree of the people of God that we can be open about that and say, let me share with you what I learned from my mistakes so you don't repeat them. We don't worry about people going, well, what? You made a mistake? Yes, you did. You did. Everyone does. Everyone does. We help each other in that regard. We lift each other up in that regard. We point each other towards God in that regard. We don't excel because we know the ways of the world. We excel. We will be blessed. We will please God when we are excellent in His ways. And we don't just sit in them. We want to build them up, drive ourselves to them, encourage ourselves to them. Even in Hebrews chapter 10, stir one another up. Stir one another up. towards love and those good things. That's the challenge for today. Tricky parable. Even the later parts of it, it gets fun. But those are the good things about the Bible. There should be challenging parts. There should be challenging parts where we have to sit in it and unpack it in truth. And what is God saying? And we'll use God's words to define what God means in that. But it can never go against what Jesus' nature and character is. And it must always fulfill what God's purpose is. But I love these things. We can't be scared of them. You ever had that where you get to a difficult passage in the Bible and you're like, ew, I'll read that later. I'll stick with Jesus loves me. But we got to sit in the hard parts and navigate through them. Is this the hardest one in the Bible? Nope. But it's a good one. I hope what you're thinking about, if this is new to you, the tools that we're talking about and the ways to unpack these things in a godly way. Look at the passages before and look at the passages after. Who is his audience? What is the context? What is the full story of what Jesus is teaching? How does that impact it? Because it's important that we go in with the right perspective, and it's got to be the God perspective in that. We bring something else into it, we're probably going to misunderstand and make a mistake. But the purest perspective we had from God's point of view will give us clarity in Scriptures. And that is what's most important. That's what's most important. Appreciate you tremendously. Today, if there's a way that we can help you and serve you in this regard and help you do exactly what Jesus wants here, is to see you succeed spiritually, to see you become a child of God, a child of the Most High, and not just kind of, but all the way, and not just somewhat good at it, but as best as you can possibly be. And understand this, God has given you a certain amount of potential. And with that comes the great privilege to be able to serve in his kingdom. You have a part in his kingdom that requires you to be a child of God first, that requires you to obey the gospel first, that requires you to become a Christian. If there's a way that we can help you do that and do it well, please let us know. You are loved. Please let us know as we stand and as we sing.